There is a whole lot of Navy this morning, so I apologize for the lack of diversity. The past couple of weeks have taken me in and out of DC, from Nevada to Florida, and now here in North Carolina, so I suppose I have all of you to thank for keeping me out of DC for one more day. Thank you very much for that. So we've talked about anniversaries today, and it had me sort of this morning being struck by the history that exists, not only in our country, but very specifically in our veteran and military connected communities. This morning, I woke up in a hotel room that overlooked the amazing memorial that's here on campus at NC State. And I was remiss by the travels that I've had over the past 5 years in my role at SVA. I've traveled to 326 college and university campuses in 48 states. I've missed Alaska and North Dakota, if you know anyone there. But something that I'm struck by when we have the conversation of the civilian-military divide is the simple notion that we are divided as a nation. When you travel to college and university campuses, there's something that people walk by every single day and just don't often notice it. It's actual war memorials. There are more war memorials on college and university campuses than you would ever know. And they're as beautiful as the one here at NC State. And when you have the chance to visit them and look at them and understand what they mean and what they represent, it helps all of those understand the sacrifices that have been made through military service for the freedoms that we all enjoy today. And most people just walk by them every single day. So when you see somebody, maybe a traditional college student walking by, point it out. Stop and smell the roses, if you will, and enjoy those memorials because they exist on college and university campuses nationwide. This month also marks another very important anniversary in the life cycle of student veterans. June marks the 75th anniversary of the GI Bill. So 75 years ago, in 1944, Congress passed what we call the Service Members Readjustment Act of 1944. And really, that original piece of legislation, we now call it the GI Bill of Rights, and we all commonly associate it with education. But that original GI Bill, we wouldn't have looked at it as purely an education benefit. In the name is readjustment. And if you ever want to truly understand legislation, follow the dollars, right? Wherever Congress places the dollars is what they're placing the biggest emphasis on within the piece of legislation. And in that original GI Bill, it had a myriad of different things in addition to education. It had farm subsidies, had the ability to start a business. It had things in there for you to be able to go to school, sure, but it also had something called the 20 and 52 Club, is really what it became known as. And what this was $20 a week for the first 52 weeks of separating from active duty. This was, we would call it unemployment compensation. And the biggest bulk of the legislation dollars allocation in that original piece of legislation were actually to unemployment compensation because that's what Congress presumed that this returning generation, 16 million women and men who are coming home from fighting in Europe and the Pacific would be the opportunity to take a knee and receive unemployment compensation while they went back to school or work or the next chapter in their lives. Well, interestingly, I'll focus a little bit on the education portion, and it almost never came to be. There was an amazing legionnaire from the American Legion by the name of Harry W. Comary, who's a former national commander of the American Legion. In the 1940s, he had this notion that the GI Bill, as a portion of readjustment from military service, should absolutely include the opportunity for an education. Now, this was a radical idea at the time. You have to go back to 1940s and understand what the landscape of America looked like. So in 1940, only 7% of adult-aged Americans actually had a college education. And unless you were a white male born to parents who went to college, there was almost no chance that you would have the opportunity for an education. So the notion that the government would pay for veterans to go back to college, it seemed almost alien as a concept. And higher education was incredibly resistant to this notion. University presidents at Harvard and Columbia and the University of Chicago published op-eds in their city newspapers, actually railing against Congress for the simple notion that they would include education for this generation coming home. Simply stated, the notion was, if you let all of these veterans, though we're grateful for their service, if you let them on college and university campuses, you will take away the opportunity for those deserving Americans who deserve to be here. Quite literally, they talked of fears of the creation of what they referred to as hobo jungles on campuses, where literally millions of veterans would flood higher education campuses, taking advantage of only the dollars to go to school and not the value in education. Well, what's really interesting about this notion is you have to understand as well that the average level of education for the service members who served in World War II was only 8th grade. So when we talked about education, it was this radical idea. And for the educators in the room, we often associate higher education legislation to the Higher Education Act of 1965. But we neglect the 20 years of history that came before with the original GI Bill. The original GI Bill democratized higher education, and it flooded America's campuses with 7.8 million, nearly 50% of the World War II generation coming to college and university campuses to achieve their education. Those same university presidents, 4 years later, published retractions in all the same publications. And they said, you know, the only problem with veterans out at my campus is they're hogging the dean's list. The university president at Harvard actually published a report 4 years on when they returned home that said that the generation of student veterans that came back to his campus were the best students in the history of Harvard. Student veterans have been succeeding in higher education for well over 75 years. But with every generation, we forget that they do well, and we always focus on the struggle. Well, I'm here today to talk to you a little bit more about how student veterans are succeeding. But another notion about how I discussed dollars as the measurement. So are there any guesses as to how many or what the percentage of World War II veterans that took advantage of the unemployment compensation after World War II? That's where Congress put the most money. They didn't think they'd go to college, half of them did. Less than 5% of the World War II generation used unemployment compensation. They came home ready to work, as every generation of veterans before us and since have. And ours is like that as well. There's two stories that I'm struck by in honor of this anniversary. The first is a gentleman by the name of Don Belfort, who separated from active duty in 1943. Eligible for the GI Bill when it passed. He was an undergraduate at George Washington University, and he worked for the school newspaper. And so he was tracking this piece of legislation, knowing that as he was struggling to take one class at a time while supporting a family and working, that this new GI Bill would open up the opportunity for him to finish his degree and actually finish it as a full-time student. So as luck would have it, after the legislation passed, he had set an appointment to meet with the Veterans Administration. It wasn't a department then. And while he was sitting in the office, the gentleman that he was meeting with, the administrator, received a phone call that basically said, hey, we're ready to start accepting applications. And as luck would have it, Don was sitting right there and overheard the conversation. The gentleman hangs up the phone and Don says, well, sir, I couldn't help it over here. The GI Bill is ready to be used now. He's like, yeah, it is, but I mean, you know, what are the odds that you actually have your discharge papers with you? He said, as a matter of fact. So Don, having served in the Army, was prepared when he sat there, and Don was actually the first recipient of the original GI Bill 23 hours after it opened up. Talk about processing times, right? So for Don, I was able to have the chance last week during a ceremony with the Secretary of VA, Secretary Robert Wilkie, to meet Don's family. And Don's family shared with me what Don was involved with on campus, and I think it's very indicative of how student veterans perform today. We're leaders on campus. So I already mentioned he was part of the school newspaper, but he was also a member of the Drama Club, Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society. He was a member of the Student Government Association and active with his on-campus student veteran organization. His entire family is all college educated, and no one in Don's family had ever gone to college before him on the GI Bill. And that's like many in my generation. 63% of us are first-generation college students, just like me. The GI Bill opens up that opportunity for college education. But Don had something that he used to almost beat into his family every day. It's probably not the right way to describe your family, but it's a notion that held true. And think back to Don sitting with that administrator already having his paperwork. He said, luck is when opportunity meets preparation, so always be prepared. His family embraced that. The second is a story that is uniquely personal to me. And it's about somebody that we probably all know the name of, George H.W. Bush. Veteran of the United States Navy at the time. He was the youngest naval aviator in history when he earned his wings. He earned a degree in economics from Yale. You probably know this story, but George H.W. Bush went out on a mission in his aircraft that many aviators of his day named. It was Barbara 3. And the reason is because his first two aircraft, one crashed in training, the other shot down an enemy fire. It was a dangerous job. So out on Barbara 3, it was a crew of 3, so a pilot and 2 crew members. George H.W. Bush's plane was shot down. He completed his bombing run and then moved towards the ocean. They knew that aviators that were shot down over land didn't have a long survivability rate. So if you were ever going to be shot down in the Pacific, go down over water. So as he instructed his crew to bail out, he flew as far as he could to destroy the plane and then bailed out himself. His other 2 crew members perished in that ocean. And as he fell to the ocean with a parachute, there was a Japanese destroyer that caught the view of him. And they turned off mission to go towards him. Now, George H.W. Bush, as he fell into the ocean, a 20-year-old Navy officer, he saw that destroyer barreling down on him and he knew his fate. He saw that land was too far away to make a swim for, so he tried to make his peace with his God. And out of nowhere emerges a submarine out of the ocean. Thank God it's US. They grabbed him with a fish hook and then submerged and suffered death charges for over 10 hours after that. They saved George H.W. Bush's life. Now, he thought they would just take him back to land and get in another plane and keep going. He was on station for over a month after that with the submarine. They had to finish their mission. Later, that Japanese destroyer commander was interviewed as George H.W. Bush came to public prominence. And he said, you know, I remember that because I saw one single parachute floating down in the ocean. And we went towards it as you would during a time of war. And I didn't know it was George H.W. Bush. I didn't know that was a future president of the United States. But what I do remember distinctively is that was the day I knew that we had lost the war. Because a submarine came off station. And when a submarine does that, it quite literally gives up its location, it gives up its security and its safety. The silent service survives on stealth. So when they identified themselves for one American pilot, that Japanese destroyer commander is recalled as saying, you know, in Japan, if that had been a Japanese aviator, we would have continued with the mission and bemoaned his loss, but we wouldn't have gone and captured and retrieved him. But one submarine with a crew of over 80 risked their lives to save one American. And that was the day that I knew that we had lost the war, because America is as big as its citizens, and we'll risk ourselves even just for one American. So I think about that story and note that it unites us. I've met 5 United States presidents in my life, and I've had the chance to meet George H.W. Bush before he passed last year, and he coined me. And on the back of his challenge coin is the notion of what he did in public service. United States Congress, ambassador to the UN, he was director of the CIA, vice president of the United States, and president. But I go all the way back to him being an original GI Bill user, and I've seen his original GI Bill paperwork at his library in College Station. And so I was able to pull what he was involved in when he was on campus to strike home this notion as to how student veterans are. So before he was ever president, he was a father while he was on campus. So going back to school, a couple of kids, one would grow up to become president of the United States himself. Barbara, his sweetheart, he had married, so he was married when he was back on campus. 52% of veterans in school today are married with children. 19% of us are single parents. But he was also president of his fraternity while he was a student veteran. He was captain of the Yale baseball team and played in the first 2 College World Series as a student veteran, also having the chance to meet Babe Ruth just a few months before he passed away. He was a member of the Yale cheerleading squad. He was elected to Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society, and he was active in his on-campus student veteran organization. Veterans have been succeeding in higher education for a long time, and inscribed on President Bush's challenge coin is the notion that any definition of a successful life must include service to others. My generation, the post-9/11 generation of veterans, has served others. And World War II veterans are the giants in which my generation stands upon their shoulders. But we still have this notion by some leaders in higher education that, gee, thank you for your service, but let's be honest. If these student veterans of today were smart enough to get into college, how'd they ever wind up in the military? I hear that as I travel around the country, and it's simply false. And so being in Washington, D.C., we advocate as the voice for veterans in higher education. And this year, one of our top legislative priorities is to provide a voice for our nation's student veterans as a significant component of the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. We'll continue to be outspoken advocates on the following issues related to the reauthorization. First, incorporating Department of Veterans Affairs and Department of Defense education resources as federal funds applying to the rule to all institutions of higher learning. The 90-10 loophole has been abused long enough, and in our opinion, it's important this change is a major check on the quality of these institutions. Second, simplifying the processes for federal education benefits such as FAFSA and student loan payment options, with the caveat that simplification must not come at the expense of access to resources for student veterans and their family members. Third is maintaining key student protections such as borrower's defense to repayment and gainful employment, such that serve as important gatekeepers of federal student aid and loans, protecting taxpayers and students alike. Fourth is creating efficiencies through greater government collaboration and automatic enrollment in benefits aimed at reducing student debt. And finally, establishing greater oversight on nonprofit conversions to address a regulatory weakness at the IRS and the Department of Education. This changing tax status is the latest trend in bad actor schools, and they're using it to avoid playing by the rules. And that's just wrong. As a higher education nonprofit, Student Veterans of America is a bit different in some ways. It's important to recognize that the VA's education benefits only actually impact a fraction of the legislation and regulation that touch the educational opportunities, choices, and protections that impact student veterans. As leading veteran advocates for this important population of students, we engage a wide variety of policymakers to help them recognize how the Higher Education Act legislative process directly impacts millions of veterans. In 2017, as was mentioned earlier, the 115th Congress unanimously passed Forever GI Bill, establishing education as a right of service, no longer as an otherwise short-sighted cost of war. Another policy priority for this year is the continued oversight and implementation of this law. And as we start looking at how student veterans are performing, they're performing markedly well. The research that was mentioned that we've done earlier was actually in partnership with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Student Veterans of America is the only public-private partnership in the country to study not only the efficacy of the GI Bill, but the overall success of this generation of students. As I travel around the country, I continue to hear myth and misperception that seems to pervade about how the contemporary student veteran is performing in post-secondary education. So I'd like to share with you a little bit of insight in what we've learned studying 1.854 million individual veterans to utilize the GI Bill. The first misconception about veterans is that we're not actually going to go to college very much. Sound familiar to the World War II generation? With the GI Bill, you can transfer it to your dependents, and so most assume that many veterans would transfer the GI Bill to our dependents. There's less than 72,000 dependents using the GI Bill and over 900,000 veterans using the GI Bill. So those scales don't even tip. The next assumption is that, well, veterans have the opportunity to use their GI Bill for any type of education and training, to include vocational training and certificate-based training. Well, since 2009, less than 5% of veterans have ever done that. 95% of us have pursued post-secondary education with the GI Bill. The next assumption is that we must all only assume to go to community college because many are like me, enlisted veterans. And since most likely we didn't go to college before we served, we might not choose to go to a four-year college. Well, this is where the data gets a little bit funky. So essentially what we know is about 67% of veterans that graduate with a four-year degree start at community college. That said, the majority of us are not graduating from community college. That's not a bad thing necessarily if we're matriculating into a four-year degree and ultimately on to grad school. And what's difficult further is that many veterans are no longer using their GI Bill at community college. And there's a reason for that. We've done the math. Thanks to great state legislation, community college credits are incredibly affordable. So we're paying out of pocket for those credits, preserving our GI Bill to finish a two-year, transfer to then finish a four-year, and have extra GI Bill left over for graduate school. That is becoming more and more common. So the next association is, well, okay, if most veterans are going to four-year and graduate schools, and if you look at the GI Bill, here's how the degrees stack up, earned on the GI Bill. And I think that's important, earned. Not aspired to, not pursuing, but completed. So earned on the GI Bill, the #1 degree earned using GI Bill benefits is a bachelor's degree, followed by a master's degree, then an associate's degree, and then a terminal degree such as a JD, PhD, MD, and the like. And 90% of the veterans that have used that benefit are just like me, enlisted. 1% warrant officers and about 9% commissioned officers. So if you think about it, the degrees held by veterans, most, are actually enlisted veterans. Now, officers definitely have their degrees before they come in, but there's just more enlisted veterans and more of us go to college, so the numbers stack up that way. Well, the next association is, okay, if they're going to four-year and graduate schools, I hear that they're all a bunch of underwater basket weaving majors. They're not pursuing academically rigorous degrees. What couldn't be further from the truth? The first notion that I'm going to make is a tie back to World War II. So we've been able to figure out what the top 3 majors were for veterans that used the GI Bill, that original GI Bill over 75 years ago. In this order, they were business, science, engineering, math, and health-related fields. It was recently stated that if it weren't for the original GI Bill, we wouldn't have had enough engineers and scientists and mathematicians to put a man on the moon. Think about the impact that that bill had. Well, now what are the top 3 majors for our generation, the post-9/11 era veterans? In this order, they're business, science, technology, engineering, math, and health-related fields. It's the same. What we also know is that the majority of veterans, when they separate from active duty, wind up doing a job that is totally different from what they did in the military. Because they're going to school, earning an education, and they're not going to college to find themselves. We leave that to high school kids. Ours is a generation going to college to create ourselves through the transformative power of higher education and set ourselves up for success when we graduate. So how are we performing? Well, the easiest measure for this is the GPA. The nationwide GPA in America, and I'll be generous and round it up, it's a 3.1 for all students in a post-secondary degree program. For veterans right now, it's a 3.35. We are outperforming our civilian counterparts. And the last myth that we hear so regularly, well, even if that's all true, they're struggling, man. They're not graduating. Okay. So the nationwide success rate in America for all post-secondary education students, meaning do you start college, do you ultimately graduate with a degree, is 68%, and that's respectable. But it wouldn't be good enough for veterans. We're currently at 74%. So by any measure, today's student veterans are not only outperforming our civilian peers, we're thriving in higher education. And when we graduate, we have lower unemployment rates and higher earned income. Right now, a veteran with a bachelor's degree on average is earning $17,000 more per annum than our civilian counterparts who have never served. And with a master's degree, we earn $29,000 more. And with degrees in the most academically rigorous fields, they're also the most marketable fields. And they're filling critical skills gaps that America's students right now are not pursuing, if not for veterans. So I ask all of us, what is our mission to the moon? Because America's veterans today are going to solve the complex problems of tomorrow. And no matter how divisive we feel as a country, those that have worn the cloth of our nation possess an inherent leadership. And I'm not here to purport that my generation isn't without our challenges or struggles, but in the face of all of them is resilience. And when you look at the aggregated national data, my generation is outperforming nearly any generation that has come before. So if you think back to that World War II generation, we call them the greatest generation. Well, know that we didn't start calling them that until 1998, when Tom Brokaw wrote a book by the same title. Prior to 1998, we called them the GI generation because of the GIs that they were called when they served, and the sheer percentage of them that did, and the GI Bill that was ushered in to help support them when they came home. And though I would not argue one iota, they are certainly the greatest generation and earned that moniker. If you think about it hard, they didn't earn that until 53 years after they came home. And rightfully so, we want to see how they performed. But about 50% of them went to college. Over 77% of the post-9/11 era has completed already an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree or higher. We are not only beating the World War II generation, we are the most educated subsect of any generation of veterans that have served or any subsect of American citizens. ours, the post 9/11 era of generation of student veterans that are on campuses right now, are not only succeeding, they're thriving. And with the leadership that they learned in the military, the education that they've earned with the most generous benefit for higher education period, they're succeeding in the classrooms, they're volunteering on campus, they're making their communities better, and they are going on to perhaps earn the title, the next greatest generation. I thank you all for being here. I can't wait to connect with some of you during the breakout sessions. Thank you for committing yourselves to student veteran success, because this is the generation that will solve the problems that ail us. Thank you so very much.